What do we mean when we talk about the Gothic in literature, particularly when addressing the 18th and also the 19th century? There are a number of texts that are often recognizable as Gothic through the use of a number of literary conventions. So often when you read a Gothic text, you will recognize these common elements that they have. One of them is, of course, setting. Gothic stories are often set in specific locations, like old castles or ruined monasteries. The latter particularly, of course, of note for us here in Greifswald, where we have one of the iconic ruined monasteries that emerged in Romanticism, but also laboratories, ruins, or desolate mountains. Another common element is certain plots. For example, female innocence that is pursued by male aggression. That is particularly when we're looking at 18th century Gothic, it's a very common theme. This image of the innocent young girl fleeing through this underground dungeon, being pursued by some kind of Gothic mad villain. And that brings us, of course, to the characters. There are set characters in Gothic fiction. The Gothic villain, often in the form of a monster, but also in the form of ghosts, later vampires, and of course the innocent young woman as a central character. So we have these settings, different certain plots that we recognize, and certain characters that we recognize. And from the perspective of literary history, there's also very recognizable fashions in Gothic writing that we can identify. One of them, sort of a first wave of Gothic writing, emerged in England in the 1790s. Really, in these 10 years, there is a surge in Gothic writing, which then recedes at the beginning of the 19th century. But there is a second wave of great Gothic writing that comes at the end of the Victorian age, at the end of the 19th century, with classic texts like Bram Stoker's Dracula, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, or Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. So there are many different factors that contribute to explain this phenomenon, why particularly in the 1790s we would have that surge in writing. Part of that, as I will argue, comes from aesthetic history, from the development in our understanding of aesthetics. The 1790s are also a period of intense political unrest, and that was conducive to sort of expressing anxieties and fears in writing, and also because this was a phase of literary experimentation and sometimes just personal obsessions with topics that bring writers to write in this mode. But there is no single account that has been able to establish a reason for the immense popularity of Gothic writing at this point in time. We can notice it there, but of course what we want to do here is to ask ourselves what is at the core of the Gothic, and why is that something new? What is innovative about the Gothic? Because after all, fantastic fictions had been around forever, and terrifying stories of ghosts or monsters had been around for quite a while. So what's new about Gothic writing in the 18th century? So the first aspect ties into what we have talked about in the previous video about this shift in emphasis towards what we can call the affective qualities of a piece of art, basically what it does to us and how it affects us. And of course, one of the effects that art can have on us is it can make us afraid. And that is really what the Gothic is all about. It's literature that is geared towards making us afraid. And it uses that distance, right? Remember how Burke said, yeah, but you got to have some kind of distance between you and the terrifying thing in order for it to make it pleasurable. And of course, the mediation through art is exactly that. If you read about the monster, you know it can't kill you, and still it makes you afraid, but just a little bit, and that is pleasurable. We can see this nicely here in this contemporary cartoon of these ladies enjoying being frightened by someone reading to them. And yes, it was the Gothic was a particular female experience as well, in that there were a number of women writers and a number of women readers of the Gothic. So it partakes of that, and it can do that because it is freed from the constraint of didacticism. Suddenly, literature doesn't have to be about teaching, but it can be merely or mainly about making us feel something, and in this case, it is fear. But in addition to that, it does what it does in a specific kind of way. And we could describe that basically as a merging of the fantastic with the real. This is really what is new about these stories of hauntings and ghosts and castles and monsters and demons, is that they are being told in a realistic narrative mode. We have seen how the beginning of the 18th century develops realist narrative as a mode of writing, and the Gothic basically takes this mode of writing and fills it with these fantastic elements. And that of course means that it brings back the effectiveness, it combines the effectiveness of both of these modes. The making us afraid, but making us afraid of something that seems very probable, that could actually happen. And that of course brings the terrifying much closer to home. So it's very effective, and it also means that it changes the Gothic. As long as you describe it as something that is merely fantastic, that is merely fairy tale-like, you externalize all of these elements towards something that is very much separate from you. But this bringing the Gothic stories into our world and closer to our understanding of how reality is also means that it starts what we can call an internalization of the Gothic, of that which is terrible, which is, I mean, this was one of the reasons why fairy tales and myth and so on were developed, to give shape to something that is inexplainable. And you give shape to your fear by creating a monster that you invent and that you put there in front of you, and then you can look at the monster. This is what I'm afraid of. So this is the Gothic villain as the other. But because of that merging with the real, one thing happens is that we start to explain the terrible more in terms of our own, of that which is real, not a ghost exists and that is an explanation of the terrible, but rather that is a reflection of myself. So then you get something like Frankenstein's creature, which is clearly it's an externalization, but it's also a double of its creator. It reflects a number of aspects of its creator. So it brings the Gothic other and what is supposed to be the hero closer together. And the hero in Frankenstein is frankly not very nice. We don't really like him all that much because he has his own troubles, and that is connected with the monster, until later on in the second wave we get a story like Jekyll and Hyde, in which the Gothic hero and the Gothic villain are indistinguishable because they are all the same persons, and it's basically just a psychological difference between these. So that's the long-term development, but it starts with this introduction of, or this merging of the fantastic with the real. And of course, very importantly, from a literary perspective, what the Gothic does, it taps into the potential of our subconscious fears, those fears that we cannot speak about, that we cannot clearly address. And because these fears are not outspoken, they need to be translated, and they're translated into images, into symbols, literary symbolic images. This, of course, what you can see here is probably the most well-known and famous depiction of the Gothic. This is Henry Fuseli's painting The Nightmare, which does something similar. It creates symbols. First of all, a very conventional symbol of the this sort of demon-like figure that we see here, but I don't know how well you can see it on the screens. But there is something looking in on this scene, and that's a horse. And we can ask, what is the horse doing here? And the horse is obviously, it's a symbol. It's also play on the word nightmare. But it creates an image, and it creates an image that is not easily dissolvable. Fear evokes symbols in order to express themselves, and the other way around. You create symbols and they evoke that kind of fear. And that is, of course, a very literary way of going about things. So the unconscious evades rational analysis, a fear that cannot be conquered because it cannot be made concrete. And in that we can, of course, also see a very, very strong counter development to the Enlightenment and to its confidence and rationality. Remember, I said this is basically, if you boil down the Enlightenment, it is confidence and rationality. Everything can be explained. The light will be there, and it will shine in every corner. And here we have this basically this mode of writing that says, yeah, but there are some corners where the light never comes, and this is where fear lurks. Even though we seem to be able to explain everything, we can't explain some of our fears, but we want to learn about them. We are fascinated by them. They will not let us go. They basically constantly emerge from the ground like these Gothic creatures. So really, in a way, it's a counter-Enlightenment development as well. Okay, now let's also talk a little bit about literary history, about the Gothic from a literary history perspective. And there really is sort of, in the English context, there is a founding father of the Gothic, who is a very famous son, and that is Horace Walpole. Now, you might remember when I was talking about, briefly talking about theater in the 1720s in England, that there was a lot of political theater, that was satirical and that was directed against the government, and particularly against one person in the government, and that was Sir Robert Walpole, who was the inventor of the prime minister position. And Robert is the father of Horace Walpole. So he has quite a heavy baggage in the background, but it also means he certainly didn't have to write for money, and he could sort of live out his personal literary obsessions in his writing. And not only in his writing, Horace Walpole, that is also famous for basically recreating the quintessential Gothic setting in real life, in that he takes this castle, Strawberry Hill, and then basically remodels it and reworks it to the point where it looks like it came straight out of the Gothic story. So this is how it looks like. It has been recently renovated to its full glory. So you can see that there is quite a lot of work that went into this, but also that this isn't really any actual architectural historical phase, but this is sort of a reinvention of some pseudo-medieval castle that was created in the 18th century. And not only on the outside, it is even more impressive if you go on the inside and take a look at how Walpole decorated everything inside as well, according to this taste in the Gothic. So, and Walpole, he worked on this starting in 1749 and worked all the way until 1776. So for decades, this was basically his life's work. But his major literary achievement, of course, was a text. And his text is The Castle of Otranto, which he calls a Gothic story. This is where the name also comes from for the mode of writing, originally published in 1764. Published pseudonymously, without the name of the author. And it actually has sort of elaborate it comes in an elaborate disguise of being a 16th century Italian romance that is only translated, and then Walpole is just sort of the translator who gives us that old manuscript. And this is something we will find in a lot of Gothic writing of the time, this idea that this is a found manuscript from earlier times. For the narrative's most remarkable features, its emphasis on miracles, visions, necromancy, and dreams, the editor actually apologizes, explaining that such superstitions were current at the time the story is supposed to have taken place. Now remember, the Gothic tries to render the fantastic as realistic as possible. Now here this is done by saying, well, I'm sorry that you have all of these strange elements here, but this is really from another time when people still believed that. But the book was immediately successful, so much so that Walpole felt confident enough for a second edition to add his own name to the title page, and also to add a preface in which he explains his motivations in writing this work, where he says it was an attempt to blend the two kinds of romance, the ancient and the modern. So what I meant by merging the fantastic and the real. In the former, all was imagination and improbability. In the latter, nature is always intended to be, and sometimes has been, copied with success. Invention has not been wanting, but the great resources of fancy have been dammed up by a strict adherence to common life. The author of the following pages thought it possible to reconcile the two kinds. So yeah, I mean, it's nice to write about reality, but it's also a little bit boring, so why not throw a ghost or two into the mix? And with this one rather short, this really very short novel, Walpole basically sets the formula for countless dozens, if not hundreds, of follow-up Gothic stories, where most of the elements are already there. We have the setting in medieval time, a predilection for scenery of underground passageways and castle ruins. We have the exploration of male tyranny and female persecution. So there's this basic plot, and of course the supernatural events that make the story inexplicable, and that evoke the fantastic. Walpole does not succeed as well in creating the realist part. I wouldn't call this a great novel by any means. It certainly has its flaws. You can certainly see that he's sort of trying to combine these elements, and he was definitely better at invoking these Gothic elements than at also creating a comprehensible idea of the real. So we mainly read the text for its entertainment value, but also particularly for how it is a founding document of the Gothic. So Walpole's work is taken up and developed further by several writers, two of which can stand for the different developments that the Gothic will take, and they basically stand for two major strands in that kind of writing, all the way into horror fiction of today. And these writers are Anne Radcliffe and Matthew G. Lewis. Both permanently altered Gothic writing through their own intervention, but they did so in very different ways. Radcliffe looked back to the novel of sensibility, which I will talk about in the next video, whereas Lewis opted for a sensationalism that was Sadian in its nature. Radcliffe strove towards poetic realism, whereas Lewis exulted in pastiche and irony. And Radcliffe usually explained the supernatural as the product of natural causes, whereas Lewis left it as a problem. And to understand the difference between these two writers, we need to ask ourselves a question. And the question is, which one is the scarier Alien movie? Alien or Aliens, which is the second of those. And if that reference doesn't make any sense to you, you should stop this video right now, go wherever you need to go to get these two movies, watch them one after the other, and then tell me which one is the scarier one. Okay, have you come up with your answer? Well, if you were in the 18th century, the answer would have depended largely on whether you were Anne Radcliffe or Matthew G. Lewis. Lewis would have opted for the second one, which is the gorier one, which is the more extreme one, and Radcliffe would have opted for the first one, which the major characteristic of it is that you don't get to see the alien for most of the movie. And Radcliffe actually talked at length in an essay about exactly this difference, the difference that, as she says, obscurity makes in the effect of the Gothic. Remember that the Gothic is all about the effect, and she makes this distinction between the effect of terror and that of horror as two possible reactions to the sublime. And this is from this essay, which is given as a dialogue between different people. So here Mr. S says, "That may be, and I perceive you are not one of those who contend that obscurity does not make any part of the sublime." This was a point by Burke where he says something has to be obscure in order to be sublime. The mountain has to be so big that you can't see all of it. Because if you can see all of it, then your mind has already comprehended it and has already made it smaller. So it must be something that is only partially visible. And Mr. W, the other speaker, says, "They must be men of very cold imaginations, with whom certainty is more terrible than surmise. Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, the other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. I apprehend that neither Shakespeare nor Milton by their fictions, nor Mr. Burke by his reasoning, anywhere looked to positive horror as a source of the sublime, though they all agree that terror is a very high one. And where lies the great difference between horror and terror but in the uncertainty and obscurity that accompany the first respecting the dreaded evil?" So terror is that which just hints at the terrible, which means we need to imagine it, and that is something that for Radcliffe expands our mind and enlarges us, whereas horror is just something that is terrible horrible in that sense that you actually get to see the horrible stuff, and everything is spelled out, and that just contracts you and freezes you and shuts down your mental faculties. And you can, of course, see most of those elements exemplified in her writing. She wrote numerous Gothic novels that all follow a certain style and a certain formula with key characteristics. One of them, as I already mentioned, is that the supernatural is usually rationalized. It's usually that things appear to be supernatural, but then gradually the protagonists find out that there are actually good explanations for that, and which means that the novels in the end turn around what we might call misguided sensibility. So overexcited heroines usually who tend to see the mysterious and the Gothic in everything around them, and then have to come to realize that there are actually explanations. Also, we see the connection to this idea of the sublime in nature, in that there is quite a lot of scenery description. This is something that kind of puts off contemporary readers, that she has these pages-long descriptions of the scenery, but they're very important for her evoking of the grandeur of the sublime in many respects. Most well-known is the one that you can see here, The Mysteries of Udolpho, a refinement of some of the quintessential Gothic features. And it contains a serious investigation into sensibility that stands at the center of all of Radcliffe's works. Explaining the supernatural is, of course, in a way also her way of dismissing it, asserting that the world is ultimately rational and empirically knowable. So here we have someone giving in halfway to this pull of the irrational and of the dark, but then emerging out of that as a reinforcement of the rational and the knowable. Her reasoned explanation may justify certain events or objects in her narratives, but they seldom, and she well knew that, account for the power that those events or objects have over the human mind. This isn't like a detective novel which you read for the brilliant solution. You read it for the mystery. You read it for this phase in your reading experience where you're held in suspense whether there is really something mysterious going on or not. Once the mystery is lifted, then also in a way the interest is gone out of the text. In contrast, Matthew G. Lewis's The Monk, his most successful work and the one through which he redefined the Gothic, recounts the fall of the powerful monk Ambrosio, whose pride in his own virtue leads him to carnal temptation and then later on to an adoration of the devil even. Ambrosio is left as an infant at the monastery, but he has been so perverted by the unnaturalness of convert life that he has become petty, hardened, and tyrannical. And yet he is a complex character. He's a more complex character as the Gothic villain than for example, the villains in Walpole's work or even in Radcliffe's work. So what we get here is a complex psychological portrait of the major villain that serves to generate sympathy, even with this terribly perverted character, in a way that was new to the Gothic. There is quite a lot of horror in the Radcliffian sense in The Monk, certainly. The narrative presents one episode of horror after another, and Lewis's willingness to go to extremes to affect his reader was really unprecedented at the time. Ambrosio gazes at the naked Antonia in an enchanted mirror. He uses a magic myrtle to gain access to her bedchamber. But there he is thwarted by her mother, Elvira, whom he then kills. And finally he drugs Antonia so that she appears to be dead and that he may later rape her amid the corpses in the vault where she has been interned. When he's discovered here, he kills her. And having done all of this, Ambrosio learns from Lucifer that Elvira was actually his mother and Antonia was his sister. As if the crimes themselves are not enough, Lewis then gives his reader some ex post facto matricide and incest. Scheduled to be punished for these crimes by the Inquisition, Ambrosio gives his soul to Lucifer, who promptly pierces his skull with his talons, carries him up into the sky and drops him down a rocky precipice to die by a river. Unable to move to satisfy his burning thirst, Ambrosio dies slowly, tormented by insects over a period of 6 days. I hope you can see that there's quite a difference to the kind of narrative that we find in Radcliffe. So this was a sensational book. It actually turned into a huge scandal once it came out that the writer, Matthew G. Lewis, was actually a member of Parliament. So that caused an uproar. That how can a politician, a member of Parliament, actually write something as gruesome as this? And that easily turned it into one of the most notorious works of its time, and it became basically the father of if Radcliffe is sort of the mother of psychological thrillers and that kind of horror, then Lewis is the ancestor of the splatter and slasher variety of horror. Of course, when we talk about the Gothic, one text that we cannot ignore that again takes the Gothic writing in a different direction is a text that is firmly entrenched in Romanticism. We'll talk about Romanticism, of course, later on, but I have to put that in here, and that is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It emerges out of a very famous episode in which a number of romantic writers start a ghostwriting contest to find out who can come up with the scariest story. And Mary Shelley comes up with this idea of a man creating a human life out of body parts, and then being unable to cope with what he actually has done. And that's the germ of the novel, and she goes on to write this novel. So what she brings to the story is, of course, science. She brings in this is part of the development of merging the fantastic with the real, to not just depict it in a realistic technique, but actually to try to explain scientifically some of the fantastic elements, like bringing a dead person back to life. And with that, in a way, we can say that she starts science fiction. Frankenstein is often seen as the first sci-fi novel in literary history. It continues, of course, also the tradition of the overreacher that we have encountered first in the plays of Marlowe on the early modern stage. You can see here that the subtitle, the less well-known subtitle, I guess, is The Modern Prometheus. And Prometheus was this mythical figure who stole fire from the gods to give it to human beings, and who was punished eternally for that. So another overreacher figure that romantics were very much interested in. So here the quest for knowledge is seen as dangerous or as wrong when it knows no limits. Not everything that can be done should be done. So we can also see that this credo of the Enlightenment, that we will become ever more perfect if we continue our scientific investigation into the world, is also put to the question. But maybe there are limits to what we can do, whether we should do that. So it creates both a counter image to enlightened optimism, and, as we will see, to romantic idealism as well. And is foundational text for sci-fi. And of course, with the creature, Frankenstein's creature, it creates one of the primal archetypes of horror fiction for the next centuries to come.